Hello and welcome to the Environmental Speaker Series. My name is Stefan Freeland. I'm the coordinator of the series. We're on Zoom for everybody, so welcome both students and alumni to today's presentation. We'll have time for questions at the end, or maybe throughout the discussion. You're welcome to submit those via the Zoom chat, and we'll deliver those to our guest. Our guest today is Tim Ballew, and Tim is a member of the Lummi tribe. And to introduce and welcome him to not our campus, but at least our afternoon, we have Laurel Ballew. Laurel is, among other things, the executive director of American Indian, Alaska Native, and First Nation Relations at Western Washington University. She serves as the tribal liaison to President Randhava, and she's an enrolled member of the Swinomish tribe, as well as an alumni of Western. And she also has a personal connection to our guest, making her the perfect person to do the introduction. So Laurel, welcome and thank you. And Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Stefan. And welcome to you all. I come to you from the, welcome you all from the beautiful Lac-Timich territory on this bright and sunny day. Thank you for joining us. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, who just happens to be my partner of 40 plus years, Timothy Ballew Laholman, and who is a Lummi tribal member, lifelong fisher, and gatherer of the Salish Sea, here to share with you his way of life. And so, yeah, thank you all. And Tim, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. First of all, it's a great honor of mine to be here today to speak about a way of life. First and foremost, I need to let you guys know that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Lummi Nation or the Lac-Timich people. These are my views, my family's values. Just to remind everybody that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Lummi Nation. Their leaders can speak if they need to, but yes, my name is Timothy Ballew Sr. If you come with me into our community, the majority of people that I cross paths with would first say Laholman, Laholman. That's my family name. It was given to me by our grandmother. It's a few generations old, but that's how they recognize me as a individual in my community, our community, and they that pays a lot of respect. I truly believe that. But I come from the Balt Celestine family on the female side, which is the Swan clan. And on the male side, I come from the Solomon Ballew family, which is the Eagle clan. Both clans have a very important role, not only in our community, but a role in the way we live as family here in the Lummi Nation, Lac-Timich territory. But that's just a little bit of history of who I am. And if you study the history of these two families, they reach all the way up to Cape Flattery, to the Stalo Nation on the Fraser River, a great long territory, yeah. But that's who I am, and that's where I come from. So the 22nd of January next week would be the mark of the Point Elliott Treaty, which was 106, it would be 167 years that the treaty was signed by our people, the United States government, the then Governor Stevens, And in the treaty, one of the most important things for me as a survivor of the treaty is Article 5. Article 5 in the treaty stated that we gave 50% of our resource to the state of Washington. We retained 50% of the resource, which is a great thing, I think. However, I have thoughts about the treaty, my own thoughts, my own feelings, only because of how it was presented, the year, the season it was presented. Let's think about January when Governor Stevens met with our people. Why was it January, one of the coldest times of the year, to meet and agree to something that affected everybody in this territory? Logistics, yeah. I guess that's federal government for us. You know, I may complain about it or I may feel bad about it, but that's my feeling. You know, there was a lot of just logistics that played into the treaty. You know, but with the treaty, 1974, there was a landmark case in the federal court system, the Bolt decision. I hope everybody has studied, heard about the Bolt decision. The Bolt decision stated, we, the Lummi people and other people in this territory, are allowed 50% of the harvestable salmon. With that, you know, the decision talks about fishing in common. Fishing in common defines that we will retain 50%. We will harvest 50%. However, today, you know, I think I've seen the best and the worst of the Bolt decision. Like Laurel said, I'm kind of a lifelong harvester, fisher. You know, the water is the number one thing for me in my lifetime. Everything I've done in water, worked in water, played in water, did ceremony in water. You know, it's the important thing for me in my lifetime. And I discussed this with my two grandboys when we're fishing in the Salish Sea. You know, we have to remember how we define sovereignty here in our community. You know, I'm blessed, really blessed as an individual. When we go harvest, there's 3 generations on the boat. Myself, our son Timothy Ballew, our grandson Timothy Ballew, and our other grandson Tandy Ballew. You know, 3 generations on a boat. That's true sovereignty. We have to remember that's how we practice sovereignty. That's how we define sovereignty. But you know, it's slowly changing because of habitat. We have to remember habitat has changed the past 60 years. Why has it changed? I think people did not care what habitat was or what it really represented when I was growing up. You know, I was the owner operator of my first fishing vessel at the age of 11 years old. I don't think we see that too much anymore this generation. If you think about it, 11-year-old owning his own boat, fishing on his own, going out into the Salish Sea on his own. Our parents really had trust of who we are and what we were capable of doing. You know, when I was fishing, I would leave on a Sunday and not return back home till a Friday evening. You know, I actually lived on my boat. I lived in the water. And, you know, if you can imagine 11 years old, gone for 5 or 6 days, people would think, oh, what are they really doing? Are they really fishing? You know, but it was, fishing was part of who we are. You know, they say it's part of our blood. it's in our blood. And I guess I'll really speed up forward. Um, my wife, Laurel, our oldest son, they both went to Western at the same time. I could recall one time they were driving to town and she told him, wouldn't it be great if we were at Western at the same time? So of course they went and attended and finished the education at Western. He graduated, went out and state employment. Yes, he obtained a job with the Lummi Nation, and he saved up. He saved his money. And one night he came to our house, and he told his mother, I bought a boat. I bought a fishing boat. And, it was kind of, my wife was kind of disappointed. Laurel was kind of disappointed. And because she always pushed education, pushed education. That's who they were. That's who Laurel's family was, education. And, I didn't really say much, but, in a way, though, I was really proud of what he accomplished, how he did it, even though he fished with me when he was probably 5 or 6 years old. And, he didn't complain. He didn't ask questions. He just did what he was told when he was 5 and 6 years old. But, that's just the way it was. And I think that's the way it should be. He's part of this community. He's part of the Lactamish community, as well as he's part of the Swinomish community. He shared a lot of great time on the water with his grandfather, Kotsputsuit, Laurel's father. He even, I guess I'm going to say it, he even went outline with Laurel's dad fishing. He went to the Swinomish territory and harvested salmon. And finally, the law enforcement caught up to them and kind of scolded Laurel's father, saying, no, 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 you can't have a Lummi in our territory fishing. Again, that was part of boat decision. One of the toughest things I disagreed with on the boat decision was a great thing, but they made us choose. They made us choose which tribe we're going to enroll in, even though we had different ties with other communities. Like I mentioned, our female side, it went far as Nia Bay, the Nia Bay community, and it went far as Stalo Nation up on the Fraser River. But both made me choose. I had to choose which tribe I was going to participate in harvest for. But when I say I seen the best of the bolt decision and I seen the worst of the bolt decision, I think when I speak about the best, in the 60s and 70s, there was a great volume of salmon still. It was a great thing to witness. It was a great thing to see. When we're in the Salish Sea traveling, you can smell salmon as we're moving forward, going to a different site. It's simply amazing that you could witness and smell that. And I don't know if people believe that, but that's a true story, that relationship we had with the salmon. When I speak about relationship with the salmon, we have to remember we are all related to the natural world here in indigenous ways of life, the community. One of the stories is, I'm kind of jumping around, I'm sorry, but the sockeye salmon was one of the most cherished fish that we harvested. We harvested it, we put it away for the year. We made sure we had enough fish for 12 months after the season ended. But the story is, one year the sockeye salmon was very low, a low return. This was 3 generations ago. And our people were kind of in a grieving moment. And one of the Sakai runs came to an individual and told the individual how to construct and how to build a reef net to harvest the sockeye salmon. You know, when I think about that, I think of that real true relationship we have with the natural world. However, the humility of the sockeye salmon when they were ready to give themselves up to us to continue the way of life that we've always practiced. It wasn't just practicing it 1 or 2 months out of the year. It was a 12-month process. So, you know, that relationship is still important to us. A great man from Burrard Nation, First Nation in Canada, and our great grandmother Aurelia Celestine told us at one moment in time in our life, we need to speak to the natural world. We need to speak to the sockeye salmon when they're here. She said, if we don't speak to them, they won't speak back to us. Then at her closing teaching at that time, teaching and learning at that time, she said, if you really speak to them, they're going to speak back to you and they're going to give themselves up. They're going to make you go to them. We don't have to travel throughout the Salish Sea and look for them. You know, that relationship we have with the natural world, they're not myths and legends, they're true stories. You know, I'm not so sure if the outside world, when I go to Bellingham, Ferndale, Blaine, if they understand who we are as Indigenous people, who we are as family. You know, that's maybe one of the reasons why I'm here today speaking to people. I hope you guys have an open mind of who we are, who I am. You know, I'm a generational fisherman, and I truly believe one of our grandsons is going to really continue that way of life. He's going to choose that. Let's speak about our second son, Raymond Ballew. You know, he came to us at a later time in our life. It was a blessing. You know, at first, Raymond wanted to be a fisherman. He really wanted to be a harvester. He thought it was the greatest thing in life. I recall that he wanted to skip school at Ferndale. He said, I want to be a fisherman. I want to be a harvester like you, Dad. And, you know, my first thought and impression was, great, that's great. You have an idea, you have a vision. And I gave it thought. And so the next morning, you know, fishermen wake up at an early morning. You know, at 4 o'clock, I woke up and I went to his bedroom. I woke him up and I said, get up, fisherman. It's time to go. We have to go harvest. And he looked at me and he said, 4 o'clock? Why do we have to leave at 4 o'clock? And I said, this is the time we go out and meet the day, meet the world. And later on that day, he came back from school and he says, I think I'm going to just continue with my education, Dad. I'm going to think about being a fisherman. You know, I wasn't trying to not believe that he was a fisherman. I wanted him to have a real true option of who he was at that time. Maybe one of these days he will be a harvester. Maybe he'll own his own boat, you know, but you know, that's him. I'm not gonna dictate to him how he's supposed to live. Speaking about living, I truly believe my life is predetermined. I had no free will, you know, speaking about the psychology of life, the psychology of who we are as Indigenous people. You know, as I spoke to you guys earlier, fishing was part of our blood system. It's in our blood. You know, I grew up in a fishing village along the Nooksack River where there were maybe 200 homes Every home, they were harvesters. Every home fished on a daily basis. Back then, in the 60s, we fished 12 months out of the year. We harvested 12 months out of the year. Habitat was really great. The Nooksack River was probably 30 feet deep. Today, it's probably 3 feet deep. You know, we all have our thinking of what took place with the Nooksack River. I blame the state of Washington. I blame the state of Washington because they had no control over their timber harvesting. When they start cutting down trees up in the mountains, they didn't create a buffer zone for the water spill off. You know, the water spill off, it created siltation and it filled the Nooksack River up and it filled up part of Bellingham Bay. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to look at and try to fix that happened years ago. I truly believe we can fix things if we want to. We have to have that belief. We have to have that vision. You know, when I talk about the natural world, you know, maybe some of the members at Western Washington University will have that vision and work on it. You know, it's simply amazing how the natural world has changed. You know, if we speak about Bellingham Bay was one of my first places I harvested as a young person. I gradually moved out into the San Juan Islands, Point Roberts, Seattle. However, Bellingham Bay, when we were young, there was a couple operations going, a couple mills, Georgia Pacific, you know, they polluted Bellingham Bay. And I don't know when somebody's going to say, let's fix the problem. If you go really study Bellingham Bay, there's probably 2 feet of sludge in the middle of Bellingham Bay from that operation along Whatcom Creek. You know, it created a big problem. The mills created a big problem. All that soil and sawdust built out of their operation along the shoreline. It changed our whole ecosystem. You know, again, I'm not really complaining. Maybe I'm complaining, but you know, we need to consider when are we going to fix these things? let's kind of go back to the Bolt decision. You know, the Bolt decision went to the Supreme Court. For some reason, it had to go back to the Supreme Court 8 times. Our people had to go back to the Supreme Court 8 different times to define that the treaty was the supreme law of the land. I often wonder, does the government really truly believe it's the supreme law of the land? Why did we have to go back to the Supreme Court 8 different times? Again, maybe it sounds like I'm complaining, but I'm giving you history of really what's taken place here in the Salish Sea in our homeland. You know, it's simply crazy that we have to continue to repeat ourselves of who we are. As I mentioned, we've been here for a long, long time. You know, this is one of my greatest things I'm trying to study is who am I and where do I come from? So far, I'm able to go back to the year 400 of the Lakhtamish people. My goal today is I want to go back farther, so I'm going to have to go to Vancouver Island and speak to elders about who am I and why am I still here? But that's my goal. And, you know, maybe one day that's what I'm going to write about. So as Indian people, we always talk about oral history, oral history, oral history. So one day I am sitting typing, and the youngest grandson said, "What are you doing, Grandpa?" And I said, I'm writing my memoir. And he said, what is that? And he said, I'm writing the life of who I am, what I did and where I come from and what I'm doing. And he goes, so why do you have to write it? And I told him, I said, well, today in the education system, and with a sad note in that, I told him it used to be, everything used to be oral history, grandson, and I told him today we have to look at the European process. If it's not written, it didn't happen. That's a real sad thing for me. I hate to say that, but that's the way of learning. So I've been speaking for a couple of minutes. I don't want to have you people lose train of thought. Is there any thought or questions about who I am so far? Anything, Taylor?
Yeah. Hi, Tim. There were a couple of questions in there. There are a bunch of very specific questions about, fishing and this, but no questions so far specific to your question of who you are and where and your history. Thank you. Or people, put those into the chat if you have them. And here's a related question. What is the process like for learning through oral history? How does that differ from?
So I'll give you an example. Growing up, we were really blessed. When I say we're really blessed, we had a great grandmother, and she was, I could recall when she was 96 years old, we'd go sit in her living room. I think that was teaching and learning for us. Our parents, our uncles and aunties used to drop off the young people to go sit in her living room. And she would talk about life. She would talk about what it was like when she was young. I have to include, she was still 96. She was rolling a cigarette at that moment in time, and she lit the cigarette and was smoking a cigarette and kind of chuckling about how she lived her life, what she did in her lifetime, and what everything represented outside her door. That was simply amazing thing for me to witness. And, when one of us was in trouble, there was probably 18 of us grandkids in our living room. When one of the members did something wrong, she didn't just correct the one person that did it wrong. She talked to all of us. That was a different way of teaching and learning. So, it's simply amazing that her teaching style was a very humble way. Two different teachers as we grow up. Our grandmother was really different. She was very strict. Oral teaching, oral history, sometimes she pounded the table and said, you have to know this, you have to learn this, you have to remember this, and you have to remember who you are, remember where you come from. And that two different ways of teaching, yeah. And we had to understand both ways as we grew up. And again, that was a true blessing for me to sit with our great grandmother, sit with our grandmother. More importantly, I was able to fish with our grandfather when I was a young man. The oldest I can remember is I was 5 years old harvesting with our grandfather in the Salish Sea. It was simply amazing to watch and listen and understand. Our grandfather, Casimir Ballew, his way of teaching was silent. Silence is so loud sometimes it hurts your ears. That's the way he taught. One of the teachings, oral teachings that he said was, we never use profanity on the boat. And he said, if you use profanity, the salmon will hear you and never come to our area. However, sometimes we use it today. Maybe we forget our way of life. Maybe we forget our teaching. But, oral history, sometimes oral history comes from the outside of your family home. It comes from one of your uncles or your teachers later on in your life. Later on in my lifetime, 3 old men came to me and, they told me certain things of who we are as Indigenous people, how we're supposed to walk in life. What is the purpose of walking in life? At first I thought, I'm going to kind of use profanity, okay? I was thinking, what the hell is he telling me? Why is he talking about how I'm supposed to walk in life when I know I'm supposed to walk in a humble way? However, he was telling me a different way to walk. He was observing how I lived my life prior to the words that came from him. And it's simply amazing that these people had great love for us of who we are. Why would they come to us and tell us these things? Why would they talk about how we can perform our role as an individual, our role as a male, or the role of the female in our way of life? And we can't forget that. I always talk about that in my classes here at Northwest Indian College. It's simply amazing. These younger people at Northwest Indian College are so hungry for culture, so hungry of values. They tell me this every day when I speak to them and how we have dialogue. And they give me thanks for Northwest Indian College. And, that's kind of teaching and learning. We need to continue this way of life. My way of life may be different than my brothers, but still, if we look at it, it means the very same in the end, that valued system that we share. We all have a different role in our family, a different role in our community. And they speak about these things as we grow. It's simply amazing that this oral history, this teaching, it was taught on a daily basis. It wasn't a one-time deal. It wasn't a test. Our old people wanted us to remember and wanted us to cement it into our system. They wanted it to be grounded in our system. They wanted it to be grounded in our family. It gave us a sense of place of who we are and where we come from. Yes, sometimes their teachings were tough, but that's just the way it was when I grew up. I guess, am I making any sense to you guys? This whole thing with virtual education, virtual Zooming, it's very different. I wished I was standing in front of you. When I'm in class face to face, I do a lot of body language. I have to do body language to keep the fire going. When I say keep the fire going, an old man in our community 5 generations ago told us to keep the fire burning. But maybe one day we're going to go back to face, I'm not sure. But this virtual education is a little bit different. I'm going to go out on a limb on virtual education. Members that attend class take advantage. They have opportunity. And they have opportunity of saying, oh, I can't make it today, Tim, blah, 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 blah. So, we have to change our method of teaching right away. I truly believe we need to think about metaphors of how we teach, not just from 2 hours of lecture. We need to continue to get that true feeling of what is being discussed, like what is being discussed about fishing today. I'm hoping I'm making some sense. I'm hoping I'm giving some people thoughts. really my hope is for me today to let you know we, the Lactamish people, are still here. You know, we've been here since time immemorial, you know, and I don't believe we're going to go away. You know, the only thing that can make us go away is a couple reasons, a couple thoughts. And I'm not going to say those right now. But anyways, wait, do we have any questions before I move on?
Yes, far more than we'll be able to get to. There was a question in terms of your transition from being a fisher or a fisher only to being a speaker and educator beyond just your immediate family, and how and when that transition occurred.
So our mother Ernestine, she retired from education. She worked at Ferndale, and she spoke of all the great things that come from education, the great things that are shared in a classroom. Same thing with fishing. A lot of times we don't fish alone. A lot of times when we go harvest, there's several other family members that we share with on a daily basis. For instance, one time, 1978, we were on a boat harvesting sockeye salmon, and we were on the boat for 17 days straight, you know, 18 nights. And what do you think we talked about? We just didn't talk about fishing. We just didn't talk about the weather. We talked about who we were. We talked about the history of who we were. That's part of education, yeah? You know, that was simply a way of learning when you're on the boat with somebody for 17 days. There was 5 of us. And of course, you know, there's a story behind that as well. You know, 17 days on a persane boat. Just think what it was like, 5 men on a boat together on a 58-foot boat. If you give it thought, really, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably hygiene, yeah. You know, we ended up washing our clothes in salt water and everything, but you know, survival. We were practicing our way of life. You know, we didn't really mind that. That was who we are, and that's who we're always going to be. So, you know, that was a teaching. When we speak about transitioning from a fisher person going to an education system like Northwest Indian College, today in discussion in the morning session, this individual told me, Tim, I want Northwest Indian College to really talk about culture. I want them to teach values. We need to continue to talk about these 2 things, he said, or who are we going to be? What are we going to be in the next generation? And, you know, that's simply amazing. Their hunger for who they are is still there. You know, that's a great thing. So, you know, I kind of stopped class at that moment in time, and I talk about who I am and how I grew up and what was the true value of life. And so, you know, I'm not so sure of all the faculties. They follow their syllabus. Do they really deviate from their syllabus? Do we understand when we should deviate from our syllabus? You know, I understand what Western Washington University is and how they run their programs and how they teach. Northwest Indian College is a different way of learning, a different way of teaching. You know, it's more of a family oriented thing. You know, I view myself as an uncle, not an instructor. You know, faculty should be uncles and aunties. Growing up, when I speak like that, growing up, the father was never the one to correct the young boys in their family. It was always their uncle. Think about that teaching. Think about that way of learning. They didn't want the father to be the bad guy. They wanted the uncle to be the bad guy. I think that was a great way of learning, a great way of teaching. And so I did that with our oldest son. My brother John kind of took him under Timothy's wing and showed him a lot of things, talked to him about a lot of things. And, later on in life, listening to Tim speak to our community, one day he stood up and he said, everything I have learned as an Indigenous person from Lummi is I learned it by the fire or by the water. What he was speaking about was he learned everything while he was fishing with older people, and he learned everything about cooking salmon for the community. Our family, we cook for the Lummi Nation. Sometimes we cook 40 times a year. It's just not cooking, yeah? There's always time for discussion. There's always time for looking at the salmon and really thinking about what does the salmon really represent? What does the wood really represent? This way of life, we need to continue. I truly believe that. But, it has to be a daily process, I think. It has to be every day. We can't set aside our values and cultures and put it in the back burner. I hope you guys understand that. And the gentleman today, when he was speaking about culture and values, that's his wish. And this is my wish of this individual. I hope he finishes education. I hope he comes back to Northwest Indian College and is an instructor 4 or 5 years from now. That's my wish. And I never told him that because we have to have humility sometimes, yes. I don't know if that's kind of a long answer for the person that asked that question. I don't know if you understood that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. There's a number of questions circling around, in one way or another, asking, are there ways that people can support the Lummi people and or the indigenous, that type of education that you're talking about, that type of cultural preservation that you're discussing there? Are there organizations or things that people could do as an ally to further that?
Well, your president did that a couple years ago when they sought out a Native American to come and work up there. I truly love the way UVic, University of Victoria, has their institution, how they conduct teaching. They have a elder from the First Nations in their class to give them a different way of thinking, how they have a different way of teaching, because the people that, well, not only Vancouver Island, here in this territory, sometimes I think people don't know that Lummi still exists, or Swinomish or Nooksack. Yeah, you may read a sign going along the freeway, Lummi Nation, next exit. But I think Western Washington needs the courage to apply something like UVic. I think they need to have that courage to hire Indigenous people. There's a lot of Indigenous people that do know the history of who they are and where they come from. These individuals, I cross paths with them on a daily basis sometimes when I'm traveling. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I mean, sure. Here, there's another question that says, well, there's two that came up. I mean, you were talking about your memoirs. One question is, will they be recorded and will they be available so that people might learn further? Or are they just for your grandson, I guess?
Yeah, writing.
Oh, my memoir? A funny story about that. I'm sitting there typing. And Laurel goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm typing my memoir." And she goes, "You don't want me to read it, I'll correct it." That's that PhD philosophy that she's doing right now. But everything that I shared with my two grandsons is really who is Holman, who is Timothy Ballew, you know. Yeah, it may be shared. I may ask to put it in the archives at the Lummi Nation. I truly believe, a lot of things need to be recorded today, such as the Bolt decision. I'm a survivor of the Bolt decision, and I really think some of the younger generations today need to understand what was the Bolt decision, why was it, and what's wrong with it today. There's a lot of things wrong with it. And my hope is tribes that participate in the Bolt decision have enough humility to work together to try to resolve it. When I speak about going to the Supreme Court 8 times, the last time we went to court was over the culverts, the culvert case, when the state of Washington failed to have regulations, when the loggers, the individuals that were clear cutting the land, they didn't install great culverts at that moment in time. It was kind of a zip zap and we're done. And a lot of people blame us for that. A lot of people blame the indigenous communities for that. I really have a hard time understanding that they jump to conclusions. They don't know the whole story. Sometimes they need to hear both sides of the story. Somewhere in the middle is the truth. We need to understand that we have to have that humility to seek out the truth sometimes. And I hope we can move forward. I hope that this thing with the natural world, the way of life, will continue on to the next generations. Does that answer a question, maybe?
Yes. And there's a follow-up to that that's saying that it's obviously not just Indigenous youth who need help connecting. How do non-Indigenous peoples connect and understand their relationship with their communities and their the natural world around them?
I truly believe parents need to invest in time. When I say this, our oldest son, when he was in Ferndale School District, one of the teachers asked the question. She said, "Can I ask why, when somebody passes away, when there's a funeral at Lummi, why is it children miss 3 or 4 days of school?" Or she'll ask, "Why is it in the wintertime they may be gone for 1 week or 2 weeks?" Or why is it Native Americans from Lummi Nation do not look at us in the eyes? So that was some great questions. And so Laurel and I said, I really would like to have you and other teachers from Ferndale School District come out to our home and we'll talk about these things. We'll kind of do an in-service training for you guys. So it happened. And they came out and they spent the afternoon in our living room and our kitchen, and we spoke about our way of life and who we were and why we miss school when somebody passes away. Paying that respect during celebration of life is still very an important thing in the way we live today in this community, not only our community, but other indigenous communities. So it takes time, not only from just Native Americans, but it takes time from our neighbors. When I speak of our neighbors, I'm speaking about Ferndale, Blaine, Bellingham, Fairhaven, they're our neighbors. I hope they think that we're neighbors. Sometimes I really truly believe people are living in a fast-paced life and they really don't want to take time. That's my thought. That's my thought. You know, we need to develop a system where we need to continue to educate. I was truly blessed in my career. I served 3.2 terms on our council, the Lummi Indian Business Council. And one of the biggest things we fought was teaching. We'd go to Washington, D.C. to lobby 2 times a month. And we figured and we found out these people didn't know who we were. They didn't understand why we're coming to visit them. Through the whole process, the government is our trustee, yeah? Through some of the landmark cases in the 1800s, let's say the Marshall Trilogy defines sovereignty. So, we figured out we need to educate these individuals to let them know we're still here. So what we did was we framed and posted the treaty and gave it to their office to let them know that we're still here. They still have a role to support us under the treaty. I hope that answers part of your question. This whole communication education process is still needed. We still need to do it. For some particular reason, the oral history stops sometimes. There's a wall that's built for some reason outside our communities. I'm not sure why. Maybe you can answer that question for me. Why is that wall still there? Why can't we tear it down? We offer a lot of things to our families and our communities. It's I don't want to say it's disheartening, but we can't give up.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, there's much work to be done. Tim, I can't tell you how many questions we're not going to get to, and I apologize to everyone who's been posting that we're running out of time. It's a conversation to continue. We're sorry not to have had you in person on campus, Tim, but thank you for your flexibility and working with us on Zoom today and joining us. And we appreciate you, and thank you, Laurel, again for joining us as well. Super quickly next week, we're kind of a related, our guest will be Samara Almonte, and she'll be talking about the importance of environmental justice storytelling. So certainly related, not entirely oral, but a lot of oral tradition there as well in a slightly different context. Again, Tim, thank you so much for being our guest. Laurel, thank you.
Stefan, can I put Laurel on the spot?
Sure, yes.
Can I ask her to share her thoughts on the way of life? She probably has some of the same things that I do, but she comes from a great family and a great living place, the Swinomish tribe. And, I know she has a lot to share, and she continues to remind the 2 boys, they're part of the Swinomish community as well. As I mentioned, our oldest son, Tim, went fishing and got caught out lying down in the Swinomish territory, but he's not in the books. They didn't cite him. So I don't want to put her on the spot. I really think she should share something.
Yeah, you do. You're such a liar. Hey, to the remaining people, I see we still have quite a few people, and I don't want to take up too much time. But I just wanted to acknowledge several of the people in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get back to all of your questions, but please reach out to Natalie or Stefan for my email address. And if you want to get in touch with either Tim or I'll be happy to try and answer your questions. They were great questions. To Mr. Kenish in Alaska, that's great. There was another gentleman Nimi Poo, please reach out to me. I'd love to answer your question. A lot of them I wish we could get to, but real quick, the one question about our sons, because I'm a Swinomish tribal member, Tim is a Lummi tribal member. Again, it's that government regulation, where do you enroll your sons? Well, our sons are enrolled Lummi because I live here and they've been raised here, but they're still tied to Lummi and Swinomish, and they still recognize, Swinomish recognizes them as their own because through me and my family, and of course Lummi as well. So just to answer that real quick. And yeah, growing up, we have a multicultural family because our ties, as Tim stated, ran from the Canadian border to Macaw, and mine ran from the Aleutian Islands to Suquamish. So our boys and grandboys know who they are and where they come from because of that. And I take that as my responsibility as a mother and grandmother to teach them our way of life, which includes the Lummi, which, I have, I guess, adopted. So it's interesting because it's two different tribes, and you would think the cultural protocols are the same, but they're not always the same, even though, we're closely related. So it's interesting, but it's when you live in a small village and you have to find a partner, sometimes you have to leave and go away. So that's what I did. And which is really part of, it's really traditional for a lot of tribes. And so, yeah, I could speak on it more, but I won't because I don't want to take up any more time. Feel free to reach out to me if y'all have any other burning questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Tim, for making space so we get to hear from Laurel as well. Great. Okay, everybody, have a good evening. We'll see you next week. Thank you again, Tim and Laurel.